Okay, guys, today we're gonna go to Shiloh now, to the battlefield. We're gonna learn all about the Battle of Shiloh, USS Grant taking on Albert Sidney Johnston. So, let's go, and Sonic and Meg will come along too.
The Battle of Shiloh, also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, was a major battle in the American Civil War fought on April 6 to 7, 1862. The fighting took place in southwestern Tennessee, which was part of the war's Western Theater. The battlefield is located between a small, undistinguished church named Shiloh and Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. Two Union armies combined to defeat the Confederate Army of Mississippi. Major General Ulysses S. Grant was the Union commander, while General Albert Sidney Johnston was the Confederate commander until his battlefield death, when he was replaced by his second-in-command, General P. G. T. Beauregard. The Confederate Army hoped to defeat Grant's Army of the Tennessee before it could be reinforced and resupplied. Although it made considerable gains with a surprise attack on the first day of the battle, Johnston was mortally wounded and Grant's army was not eliminated. Overnight, Grant's Army of the Tennessee was reinforced by one of its divisions stationed farther north, and was also joined by portions of the Army of the Ohio, under the command of Major General Don Carlos Buell. The Union forces conducted an unexpected counterattack in the morning, which reversed the Confederate gains of the previous day. The exhausted Confederate Army withdrew further south, and a modest Union pursuit started and ended on the next day. Though victorious, the Union Army had more casualties than the Confederates. After the surprise and lengthy Union casualty list became known, Grant was heavily criticized. In fact, decisions made by both the Federal and Confederate High Command were afterward questioned by individuals on and off the battlefield. The battle was the costliest engagement of the Civil War up to that point, and its nearly 24,000 casualties made it one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war.
Okay, now we're on the Shiloh battlefield. I'm here on Grant's last line, the first stop on the auto tour, which we are doing right now. But now let's talk about the actual Battle of Shiloh. So here you go.
Battle, morning of April 6th. Edit. Early morning. Edit. Everett Peabody. Early Sunday morning on April 6th, 5 of Grant's 6 divisions were camped between the Shiloh Church area and the Tennessee River. Sherman's division was the first to occupy the Shiloh area, so his 4 brigades were camped near the main approaches to Pittsburgh Landing. Colonel David Stewart's brigade was on the Union left, east side of battlefield, near the Hamburg-Savannah Road and a ford. To the west in the Shiloh Church area, Sherman's other 3 brigades formed the Union right. They covered the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road and the Owl Creek Bridge over the Hamburg-Purdy Road, 59. In between Sherman and Stewart was Prentice's division, and between the Shiloh Church area and the Tennessee River were the divisions of McClernand and Hurlbut. To the north and closest to Pittsburgh Landing was W. H. L. Wallace's division, 60. Lew Wallace's division was at Crump's Landing, 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers, downstream, north of the Union campsites, 9. His mid-March mission had been to damage a railroad. While on this railroad raid, his men learned that a large Confederate force was nearby. Because of this Confederate force, Wallace's division remained near Crump's Landing. 61. Grant was further north at his headquarters in Savannah. Nelson's division from Buell's army had reached Savannah, but Buell's other divisions were still marching, 23. The Shiloh camps did not form a defensive line, and no entrenchments were made because nobody expected a fight at that location. 43. The inexperienced divisions of Sherman and Prentiss were the most forward, closest to Corinth, of the group. 43. Only a few pickets were in place, despite a small skirmish taking place on April 4, 62. Note 6. After hearing reports concerning sightings of Confederate soldiers in the Shiloh area, Colonel Everett Peabody, commander of the 1st Brigade from Prentiss's division, became concerned. Around midnight on April 5, Peabody ordered Major James E. Powell to take 3 companies of the 25th Missouri Infantry Regiment and 2 companies of the 12th Michigan Infantry Regiment on a reconnaissance, aka scout, to Seafield where the sighting had been made. 67. Prentiss was not informed, and Powell's men advanced from their camp southwest down a farm road that led to the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road. 68. Fighting starts at Fraley Field. Edit. Powell found the Confederate Army near Fraley Field. The Confederate 3rd Brigade of Hardee's 3rd Corps was southwest of Powell's patrol. The brigade was commanded by Brigadier General S.A.M. Wood, and he had sent forward 280 skirmishers from Major Aaron B. Hardcastle's 3rd Mississippi Battalion. 69. Hardcastle kept most of his men in the southeast corner of James J. Fraley's 40-acre, 16 hectares, cotton field, while 2 sets of pickets were positioned closer to the Union camps. 69. Around 5 a.m., April 6th, Confederate pickets fired at Powell's men before returning to the battalion. When Powell advanced within 200 yards, 180 meters of Hardcastle's main force, the Confederates opened fire. 70. The battle began with these 2 small forces fighting for over an hour. 71. Around 5:30 a.m., Confederate leaders heard the commotion at Fraley Field, and Johnston ordered a general attack. 70. Johnston instructed Beauregard to stay in the rear and direct men and supplies as needed. Johnston rode to the front to lead the men on the battle line, and this arrangement effectively ceded control of the battle to Beauregard. 72. Note 7. On the Union side, Powell sent a message to Colonel Peabody that he was being driven back by an enemy force of several thousand. 74. Hearing the fighting, Prentiss soon learned that Peabody had sent out a patrol without authorization. Prentiss was outraged and accused Peabody of provoking a major engagement in violation of Grant's orders. However, he soon understood that he was facing a large Confederate force and sent reinforcements. 75. Peabody's patrol, with Powell leading, partially ruined the planned Confederate surprise and gave thousands of Union soldiers time, although brief, to prepare for battle. 76. Although Peabody's patrol had alerted the Union Army, some Union leaders were not convinced that they were under attack. Sherman was not convinced until he was slightly wounded, and one of his orderlies shot dead, after a 7 o'clock. I'm right to investigate the commotion near Rear Field. 77. After Johnston's 5:30 order for a general attack, it took an hour before all Confederate troops were ready. Another hour was lost skirmishing at Seafield, close to Fraley Field. This reduced the Confederate advantage from the unexpected attack. 78. The Confederate Army alignment was another issue that helped reduce the attack's effectiveness. The Corps of Hardee and Bragg began the assault with their divisions in one line that was nearly 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, wide. 79. At about 7:30 a.m. Beauregard ordered the Corps of Pope and Breckinridge forward on the left and right of the line, which only extended the line and diluted the effectiveness of the 2 attacking corps. 73. It became impossible to control the intermingled units, so the corps commanders decided to divide the battlefield, and each commander led their battlefield portion instead of their own corps. 79. The attack went forward as a frontal assault. 80. Johnston and Beauregard did not put more strength on the east side, which meant they did not focus on their objective of turning the Union left. 81. Sherman and Prentiss. Edit. The divisions of Sherman and Prentiss were the first Union troops attacked. Sherman and Prentiss were the commanders of the first 2 Union divisions attacked, and those happened to be the most inexperienced of Grant's 6 divisions. 43. Sherman, who had been negligent in preparing for an attack, performed with coolness and courage, while he inspired his raw troops. 82. Note 8. Facing artillery fire and a frontal attack from the Corps of Hardee, Bragg, and Pope, Sherman's men performed reasonably well, if they fought. 72. The inexperienced colonel of the 53rd Ohio Infantry regiment, which had just repelled 2 Confederate advances, yelled, "Retreat and save yourselves," and many from his regiment ran away. 83. Eventually, at least 2 companies of the Karma men from this regiment attached to another regiment. 84. Sherman slowly moved the division back to a position behind Shiloh Church. 72. He became supported on his left by the 3rd Brigade from McClernand's division. 85. Prentiss had his camps northeast of Seafield. 86. On his right, his brigade commanded by Peabody was attacked by 2 Confederate brigades, and Peabody was wounded 4 times before being killed. 87. By 8:30 a.m., the remnants of Peabody's brigade were pushed north, and the Confederate army occupied his camp. 88. Further east, Prentiss's other brigade was attacked by brigades commanded by Brigadier General Atelier, Gladden and Brigadier General James Chalmers. 86. Around 8:45 a.m., Gladden was mortally wounded from cannon fire. 89. The Confederate troops suffered considerable casualties, especially from artillery fire. 89. However, the Confederate troops pushed on and captured the remaining 6th Division camp sometime near 9:00. 90. The Confederate soldiers had seen many of the Union soldiers running away from the front line, and now possessed the Union camps of Sherman and Prentiss. Looting became a problem, as Confederate soldiers found clothing, rifles, and food. Confederate leaders found it difficult to control their forces. 91. They paused their attack, which enabled Prentiss to move further north. 92. East of McClernand, Hurlbut had all 3 brigades ready for action at 8 a.m. After being notified that Sherman was facing a strong attack on his left, Hurlbut sent his 2nd Brigade, commanded by Colonel James C. Beach, to assist Sherman. 93. Shortly after that first message, Hurlbut was advised that Prentiss was in trouble. Hurlbut brought his remaining 2 brigades south on the Hamburg-Savannah Road near Wickerfield, and he encountered a large number of panic-stricken men from Prentiss's division who were fleeing north. Unable to stop the retreat, he settled his brigades further south near a peach orchard.
Well, now, there you go. I'm on Pittsburgh Landing. Not Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh Landing. So, let's talk about Pittsburgh Landing. And here you go.
Pittsburgh Landing and the Union left. Edit. At 9 a.m., Stuart could hear artillery fire, but was not yet attacked. Grant was in Savannah having breakfast at his Cherry Mansion headquarters when he heard the distant sounds of artillery fire. 95. He was on crutches as he recovered from a fall from his horse, and he was waiting for more of Buell's army to arrive in Savannah. 96. Note 9. Grant ordered Buell Nelson to march his division along the east side of the river to a point opposite Pittsburgh Landing, where it could be ferried over to the battlefield. 98. Grant then took his steamboat, Tigress, south to Crump's Landing, where he told Lew Wallace to get his division ready to move. 99. Grant proceeded to Pittsburgh Landing, arriving around 9:00 am. 100. Note 10. The landing was beginning to accumulate men who had fled their posts, and Grant ordered a colonel to halt all stragglers. He then rode inland and confirmed that the Confederates had launched a full-scale attack instead of a probing action. He sent a message to Crump's Landing, ordering Lew Wallace to bring his division to the battlefield. 102. Note 11. After the beginning of the battle, Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace sent his 2nd Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General John MacArthur, to fill a gap on the Union left between Hurlbut's position at a peach orchard and Stuart's brigade at the extreme Union left. 104. MacArthur had only 2 of his regiments, since the others had been sent to assist Sherman and guard the Snake River Bridge that led to Crump's Landing. His 2-regiment force was bolstered by Battery A from the 1st Illinois Light Artillery Regiment. Wallace's 1st and 3rd Brigades, commanded by Colonel James M. Tuttle and Colonel Thomas W. Sweeney, respectively, moved into positions near Duncan Field and what is now called the Sunken Road, between the divisions of McClernand and Hurlbut. 105. From 9:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., most of the fighting at this position was the exchange of artillery fire. 106. On the extreme Union left, Stuart's brigade had heard musket firing early in the morning, but did not believe they were under attack until they heard distant artillery fire. 107. At 9:30 a.m. Johnston received reports that Union soldiers were deploying on the Confederate right flank. To remedy this potential problem, he sent 2 brigades from Bragg's corps and called up Breckinridge's reserve corps. What his scouts had actually found was the camp belonging to Stewart's brigade. Stewart was near the Hamburg-Savannah Road close to Lick Creek. 108. Around 9:40 a.m. Stewart began receiving artillery fire, and 20 minutes later his men were attacked by Confederate infantry. 109. Crossroads. Edit. Topographical map of Shiloh battlefield. Shortly after 10 a.m., the remnants of Sherman's division established a new position further north from Shiloh Church. 110. This position was near a crossroads of the Hamburg-Purdy Road with the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road. 111. By this time, Sherman's 3rd Brigade, 3 Ohio regiments, was eliminated, as its last intact regiment ran away. Colonel Jesse Hildebrand, the brigade commander, remained on the field as a volunteer aide for McClernand's headquarters. 110. Sherman's 1st Brigade, commanded by Colonel John A. McDowell, was west on the Hamburg-Purdy Road and cut off. 112. Colonel Ralph P. Buckland's 4th Brigade was fragmented and ammunition was low. 113. Sherman prepared a defense with the men he had left, including Colonel Julius Wraith's 3rd Brigade from McClernand's division that had reinforced Sherman's left earlier. 112. Sherman also had the 6th Indiana Artillery Battery commanded by Captain Frederick Bear, and part of a battery from McClernand. 111. For the first time, the Union Army had a continuous front. From west to east were the remnants of Sherman's division, McClernand, W.H.L. Wallace, the remnants of Prentice's division, Hurlbut, MacArthur's brigade from W.H.L. Wallace's division, and Stewart's brigade from Sherman's division. Hurlbut was near a peach orchard, Prentice was near the Sunken Road, and W.H.L. Wallace was adjacent to Duncan Field at the Sunken Road. 112. After a failed attack and the addition of more men, the Confederates attacked Sherman and McClernand again at 11:00 am. 111. This Confederate attacking force consisted of portions of 7 brigades. 114. The Union losses in this attack included Colonel Wraith, who was mortally wounded, and Bear's battery, which fled to the rear after Bear was shot dead. 115. On the Confederate side, Wood's brigade took heavy losses, but routed the brigade of Colonel C. Carroll Marsh from McClernand's division. 116. Wood's men then defeated Veach's brigade, but Wood was thrown from his horse and temporarily out of action. At that time, his brigade became scattered and disorganized. 117. By 11:20 a.m., the Confederate Army controlled the Hamburg-Purdy Road. 118. Benefiting from the exhaustion and disorganization of the Confederate force, Sherman and McClernand fell back about 200 yards, 180 meters, north of the crossroads. 118. Sherman separated 1st Brigade, McDowell, linked with McClernand around 11:30 am.
Okay, now I'm on the Hornet's Nest. This is where a small Union army gets trapped between Confederate soldiers, and they're stuck there, and they surrender here. So here's the Hornet's Nest.
Sunken Road and Hornet's Nest. Edit. Grant's right and left were pushed back. The Sunken Road was an old wagon track called an abandoned road in the only time it was mentioned in the official records. From west to east, it ran from Duncan Field to a peach orchard, eventually known as the Peach Orchard, at the Hamburg-Savannah Road. 119. The old wagon track was so worn and washed over that it had an embankment that ranged from a few inches, 7.6 centimeters, to supposedly 3 feet, 0.91 meters. This ready-made entrenchment received the name Sunken Road in post-war years. 120. Some historians doubt that the road was actually sunken. Nothing in the official records mentions it as sunken, and the soldier who wrote in his diary that the road was about 3 feet deep was in a regiment that was not close enough to the road to see it. 121. When the fighting later became heated in this area, Duncan Field, the Sunken Road, and the woods on the north side of the road, the Confederates began calling it the Hornet's Nest. 122. At the beginning of the day, Prentice had 7,545 men present for duty. 25. By the time he moved back to Barnes Field near the Hamburg-Purdy Road, after casualties and men that ran away, he had only 600 men and portions of 2 batteries, 123. He deployed his men near the divisions of W.H.L. Wallace and Hurlbut, along the sunken road. Grant reinforced Prentiss with 600 men from the 23rd Missouri Infantry Regiment, which had disembarked from Pittsburgh Landing a few hours earlier. Grant visited the 1,200-man force and told Prentiss to hold at all hazards. 123. The Union troops along the sunken road were protected by hickory and oak trees. 122. Some Union troops at this location had modern, for 1862, weapons and fences for shelter, while some of the Confederate attacks were across open ground. These factors combined to make frontal assaults difficult for the Confederate attackers. 124. One attack was led by Confederate Division Commander Benjamin F. Cheatham, and his 2nd Brigade was thoroughly repelled. 125. Southeast of the sunken road, Stuart still held the Union left. The Confederate brigades commanded by Brigadier Generals James R. Chalmers and John K. Jackson attacked Stuart's 3 regiments. The intensity of the fight increased around 11:15 a.m., causing most of the 71st Ohio Infantry Regiment to flee to the rear. 126. Note 12. Stuart repositioned his remaining 2 regiments, but eventually they began panicking. Although Stuart restored order, he was wounded and command temporarily fell to Lieutenant Colonel Oscar Marmborg.
Okay, now I am on Jones Field, which after the Hornets left there, Grant's line has been pushed to Jones Field. Well, some of the troops are, well, this is the Confederate. I'm standing on a Confederate field where the Confederates were which, okay, here's the afternoon of April 6th.
Battle, afternoon of April 6th. Edit. By noon, the Union right was pushed back and the left was threatened. Lew Wallace's division had made little progress following Grant's order to move to the battlefield. Early in the morning, his division had been spread as much as 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers, from Crump's Landing. The purpose of this positioning was to protect routes that would be used by reinforcements in case his isolated division was attacked. 128. An additional messenger from Grant found him at 11:30 a.m., and Wallace did not get his division moving until noon. 129. Another messenger found Wallace at 2 p.m. and notified Wallace that he was on the wrong road. Wallace believed he was to reinforce Sherman and McClernand at their original camps. He was unaware that those divisions had been pushed back toward Pittsburgh Landing. 130. By noon, Sherman and McClernand had been pushed back to Jones Field. However, the 3 regiments from McDowell's 1st Brigade had reunited with Sherman and McClernand, and 3 additional regiments arrived for reinforcement. 131. McClernand's troops began a counterattack with the assistance of McDowell's brigade. 132. The Confederates were pushed back beyond McClernand's morning headquarters, and both sides had numerous casualties. With reinforcements, the Confederate forces began a bayonet charge at about 1 p.m. that pushed McClernand and McDowell back to their original counterattack line at Jones Field. 133. Early afternoon. Edit. On the Union right, the divisions of Sherman and McClernand, plus Veitch's brigade, were a disorganized group of individual soldiers and portions of regiments. Many soldiers had dropped their equipment and headed to Pittsburgh Landing. Still, Sherman and McClernand fought on with the remnants of their divisions. 134. The situation at the Union Center was much better. Prentiss repelled multiple attacks by the brigade commanded by Colonel Randall L. Gibson. 135. Captain Andrew Hickenlooper's 5th Ohio Independent Light Artillery Battery used shrapnel and canister to stop the first charge, and Confederate losses were considerable. 136. After a third try, Gibson's brigade suffered enough casualties, including one colonel hit in the face, that most of the men fell back, and the brigade was not engaged for the rest of the day. 137. Among the Union soldiers killed was Major James Powell, who led the early morning patrol that discovered the Confederate army at Fraley Field. 138. While Prentiss was defending against Gibson, Sweeney repelled Confederate attacks near Duncan Field. 139. The Union left, even more so than the right, was pushed back. Stuart's 2 remaining Union regiments, temporarily commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Marmborg in the absence of Colonel T. Gilby Smith, made several stands east of Belfield against two of Bragg's brigades. 140, note 13. Fortunately for the Union Army, Bragg's hungry men exhausted their ammunition and pillaged food from the Union camps instead of continuing the attack. 140. Around 2:15 p.m., Smith ordered Stewart's brigade to withdraw, and by 2:30 p.m. Stewart's brigade was done fighting for the day. 142. While Stewart was fighting, the adjacent position in the Union line was occupied by MacArthur's partial brigade. MacArthur's force was attacked around 2 p.m. by one of Breckinridge's brigades. 143. Despite reinforcements, MacArthur fell back about 300 yards north of the peach orchard where he stabilized his line 20 minutes later. 144. On MacArthur's right, Hurlbut's division was also under attack, causing it to fall back. Most of the attackers were from Breckinridge's 3rd Brigade, commanded by Colonel Walter S. Statham. 145. Note 14. As the Union troops fell back, they would pause to shoot at the oncoming Confederates. Artillery was also used to slow the attackers. 145.
And right over here, this is Albert Sidney Johnston's grave. This is where he was shot. He was shot in the thigh, or maybe the leg, something like that. But yeah, here's what happened to Albert Sidney Johnston.
Johnston killed. Edit. General Albert Sidney Johnston rode as much as 40 paces in front of Breckinridge's line. His uniform was torn from bullets in several places, and the heel of one of his boots was gone. 147. After sending an order to Colonel Statham, an object could be heard striking Johnston. Although blood could be seen dripping from his leg, the general did not show concern. Shortly afterwards, he was slumping in his saddle. Asked if he was wounded, Johnston replied, "Yes, and I fear seriously." 148. Johnston bled to death from a torn popliteal artery in his right leg. 149. Although a tourniquet might have saved Johnston's life, his personal physician had been sent elsewhere to treat the wounded. Johnston died about 100 yards, 91 meters, south of the Bell Farm at 2:30 p.m. 150. Note 15. He was the highest-ranking soldier killed in combat in the American Civil War. 153. With the death of Johnston, Beauregard officially became the Confederate Army's commander. 154. Some historians argue that since Beauregard was directing the army from the rear while Johnston was at the front, Beauregard already had the role of army commander. 74. 73. The Confederate attack on its right, Union left, stalled after Johnston's death, and many exhausted Confederate soldiers drank from what became known as the Bloody Pond, located between the Peach Orchard and Wicker Field. 155. The lull was caused more by the exhaustion and disorganized condition of the Confederate Army than mourning for Johnston or Beauregard's lack of action. Beauregard sent Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles to coordinate an attack on the Hornet's Nest. 156. Union left and right. Edit. Union gunboats joined the battle. At 2:50 p.m., Lieutenant William Gwynn, commander of the USS Tyler, put his gunboat into action by firing on the Confederate batteries near the Union left. After an hour, Gwynn was joined by the USS Lexington, and the two gunboats positioned themselves about 3/4 of a mile, 1.21 kilometers, south of Pittsburgh Landing. At first, the shelling, gunboat shells were larger than those used by field artillery, had more of a psychological impact than a destructive one. 157. On the ground at the Union left, MacArthur's partial brigade fought the Confederate brigades commanded by Brigadier Generals John K. Jackson and John S. Bowen. With Stewart now gone, MacArthur was also getting outflanked by Chalmers's brigade. 158. Between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m., MacArthur moved all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing. Note 16. Hurlbut's line was also falling back, and only one regiment remained by 4:30 p.m. when Hurlbut ordered it to the rear. 161. Late afternoon. Edit. Webster organized Grant's last line. Sometime in the late afternoon, Grant assigned Colonel Joseph Dana Webster, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, the task of setting up a defensive position at Pittsburgh Landing. Webster used stragglers and non-combatant personnel. He began rounding up artillery pieces, including siege guns and any batteries, or partial batteries, that retreated back to the landing. 162, 163. He eventually assembled about 50 artillery pieces, and they were positioned on a ridge on the east side of the battlefield. 164, note 17. At the Union right, Grant visited Sherman around 3 p.m. and found a difficult situation. The remaining regiments had few men, ammunition was low, and more men were either leaving or serving with other units. Some regiments had so many losses that they were ordered to Pittsburgh Landing where they could reform. 168. The Union line at this time was back to Jones Field and the surrounding area. 169. The Confederate Army facing Sherman and McClernand was reorganizing, and some of the units were shifted to the Hornets' Nest. 168. After another attack at 4 p.m., Sherman and McClernand fell back further around 5:00 p.m. 170. On the Union left, Bragg tried to pursue the retreating Union soldiers, but was harassed by Union gunboats firing with increasing accuracy. The Tennessee River was near high tide, and the Union gunboat leaders had discovered that by elevating their guns and using lower charges, they could hit targets close to the river. The Tyler had some direct hits on Chalmers's brigade beginning at 5:35 p.m. 171. Hornets' Nest becomes focus. Edit. The Union right and left were pushed back. The Confederate Army spent a considerable amount of time and resources assaulting the Hornets' Nest instead of bypassing it. Historians' estimates of the number of separate infantry charges, including those from earlier in the morning, range from 8 to 14. 172, note 18. An estimated 10,000 Confederate soldiers were involved. 172. At 3:30 p.m., the Confederate Army began moving all available artillery pieces into positions around the Hornets' Nest. 174. Soon they had, at the time, the largest concentration of field artillery, over 50 pieces, ever on the North American continent. 175, note 19. This concentration, known as Ruggles's Battery, was led by Brigadier General Ruggles. 176. In his report, Ruggles claimed responsibility for assembling the batteries, but multiple people may have been involved, including Major Francis A. Shoup, Hardee's artillery chief, and Brigadier General James Trudeau. 179, 178. By 4 o'clock p.m., the Confederate artillery was firing on Wallace and Prentiss in the Hornets' Nest. Confederate artillery was concentrated near Duncan Field and to the south near the Eastern Corinth Road. 178. It was not until 4:30 p.m. that all Confederate artillery batteries were engaged, and at least one historian believes their effectiveness has been exaggerated. 180. Shortly after 4 p.m., Hurlbut was gone from the east side of the Hornets' Nest, and McClernand had fallen back about a half mile, 0.8 kilometers, from the west side. 181. Realizing that they were going to be surrounded, Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace began leading his division north. Around 4:15 p.m., he was mortally wounded as a portion of his division escaped encirclement. 182. A ravine north of the sunken road near Cloud Field became known as Hell's Hollow, and over 1,000 Union soldiers were captured there. 183. By 4:45 p.m., most of Wallace's division was removed from the battlefield, and Prentiss was left with about 2,000 men. 184. Around 5:30 p.m., various Union regiments began surrendering, including Prentiss, and approximately 2,200 Union soldiers were captured. 185. In his memoirs, Grant was critical of Prentiss for not making a timely withdrawal. However, the Hornets' Nest stand by Prentiss and W.H.L. Wallace, who was there longer and had more men under his command, allowed Grant more time to prepare his last line. Evening. Edit. Positions at the end of the first day. By the time the Hornets' Nest fell, Grant's men had a defensive line from Pittsburgh Landing to the Hamburg-Savannah Road and further north. 188. Sherman commanded the right of the line, and McClernand took the center. On the left were the remnants of W.H.L. Wallace's division, commanded by Tuttle, plus Hurlbut's division, 40. At the landing were 10,000 to 15,000 stragglers and non-combatants. 189. The line included the artillery assembled by Colonel Webster, and the 2 gunboats were close by. 188. Grant and Webster rode up and down the line, urging the men to keep firing at their enemy. 190. The advance of Buell's army, from Nelson's division, had begun arriving around 5:00 p.m. 162, its 36th Indiana Infantry Regiment was placed on the east side of Grant's last line in time to help defend against an attack. 191, the two Navy gunboats helped defend, and the Lexington fired 32 rounds into the attacking Confederate force in only 10 minutes. 191, note 21, the Confederate attack was repelled, and shortly after 6 p.m. Beauregard called off all attacks. 191, Buell and his army, and some in Grant's army, believed they had saved Grant's Army of the Tennessee. Grant had a differing opinion, believing that by 6 p.m. the Confederate army was worn out. 195. Beauregard's situation. Edit. When Beauregard called off all attacks, it was near sunset and he assumed Grant's army could be eliminated on the next day. 196. He had received a telegram saying Buell's army was in Alabama, and did not know Grant was already being reinforced. 192, note 22, the Confederate army was badly disorganized, and it had just finished taking prisoners from the Hornets' Nest around 5:30 p.m. Attacks after dark were rare because of problems with friendly fire, and darkness would occur soon. 198, the exhausted Confederate army already had about 8,000 casualties. 199. Confederate situation appeared better than it was. For many years after the battle, critics believed Beauregard had squandered an opportunity to finish Grant's army. 200. Modern historians, such as Cunningham and Daniel, disagree with that assessment. Cunningham wrote that Beauregard's critics ignore the existing situation on the Shiloh battlefield, including Confederate disorganization, time before sunset, and Grant's strong position augmented by gunboats. 198. Daniel wrote that the thought that the Confederates could have permanently breached or pulverized the Federal line in an additional hour or so of piecemeal night assault simply lacks plausibility. 128. He mentions that it took the Confederates 6 hours to conquer the Hornets' Nest, and Grant's last line was a stronger position. He also cites exhaustion, low ammunition, and one staff officer's belief that 1/3 of the Confederate army was plundering instead of fighting. 128. Beauregard spent the evening near Shiloh Church in what had been Sherman's tent. Most of the Confederate army moved back to the original Union camps. 201. Beauregard sent a telegram to Richmond discussing a complete victory, driving the enemy from every position. 202. 203. Many of the Confederate troops believed that the battle was essentially over, and spent time plundering the camps. Some soldiers took their loot and began walking back to Corinth. 204. Some of the Confederate troops were now armed with better weapons than the ones they had at the beginning of the day. Austrian, Enfield, and Springfield rifles were taken from dead, wounded, captured, or fleeing Union soldiers. 205. It began raining at 10 p.m., and at midnight the rain became a storm with thunder and lightning. This, combined with the constant shelling by Union gunboats throughout the night, made it difficult for the exhausted Confederates to get any sleep. Because of the exhaustion and the belief that Grant's army was almost finished, the Confederate forces were not reorganized. No plans or orders were made for the next day, and it was thought the various commands would regroup at that time for a final mop-up action. 204. The original Confederate plan was to push Grant's army away from Pittsburgh Landing, and pin it against the northern creeks where it could not move quickly or get resupplied. 23. Instead, Grant had been forced back to a defensible position at Pittsburgh Landing where he could be reinforced and resupplied. 206. Grant's situation. Edit. Grant's army had 7,000 men killed and wounded, 3,000 more captured, and 10,000 men who were afraid to fight. 195. Before being reinforced, he had an estimated 18,000 fighters formed on his last line. 40. Since most of the Union camps had been captured, these hungry and tired men would have to sleep in the open without blankets, and rain and cold weather added to their misery. 207. At 7:15 p.m., 5,800 fresh troops from Lew Wallace's division arrived at the battlefield and were positioned next to Sherman. 208. Brigadier General Thomas Crittenden's division from Buell's army began arriving at 9 p.m., and 2 hours later the entire division was at the landing. Eventually, Buell would have nearly 18,000 men available for the battle. 208. The Union line from west to east consisted of the divisions commanded by Lew Wallace, Sherman, McClernand, Hurlbut, Crittenden, and Nelson. Prentiss division was effectively destroyed, and Tuttle was behind the line trying to reorganize W.H.L. Wallace's division. 208. Earlier in the day, Colonel James B. McPherson, Grant's chief engineer, asked Grant if preparations should be started for a retreat. Grant's response was, "Retreat? No. I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." 209. Buell met with Sherman at sunset and learned that Grant planned to attack at sunrise. An understanding was made that Grant would have the west side of the line, while Buell would plan his own attack on the east side. Despite Grant's seniority, Buell considered himself independent, and Grant chose not to consult with him that evening. 210. Sherman found Grant resting under a tree around midnight, and said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant replied, "Yes. Lick him tomorrow, though."
What up? We're back. We're here at the peach orchard in Shiloh. Not the peach orchard in Gettysburg. But this is the peach orchard in Shiloh. Now we're going to talk about the last day of the battle. Grant's counterattack. Massive counterattack, which the Confederates had 28,000 troops on the battlefield. Very low on ammunition and hungry and just not equipped. Oh, Grant has over 40,000 on the battlefield, well equipped and supplied. Now here we go with the last day, Grant's counterattack.
Between midnight and 4 a.m., Brigadier General Alexander M. McCook's division from Buell's Army of the Ohio arrived in Savannah. The first unit from this division to arrive at Pittsburgh Landing came ashore around 4:00 am. 212. Elsewhere, the Confederate 47th Tennessee Infantry Regiment was marching to the battlefield. This poorly armed regiment of 600 raw recruits was the only reinforcement Beauregard received, and it did not arrive until 8:00 am. 213. After deducting casualties and those who had abandoned their posts, Beauregard's Confederate army now numbered fewer than 20,000 fighters. 214. Union counterattacks begin. Edit. General overview of April 7th. On the east side of the Union line, Buell's attack began at 5 a.m. with Nelson's 3 brigades. A few hours later, Nelson was joined on his right by Crittenden. 215. The two divisions advanced, dispersed enemy skirmishers, and were gradually joined on Crittenden's right by brigades from McCook's division. 216. McCook did not have all 3 of his brigades available until close to noon. 217. On the Confederate side, Hardee commanded the right that faced Nelson, with the division commanded by Brigadier General Jones M. Withers as his most organized force. The skirmishers that Nelson had chased off earlier were Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry regiment and small portions of Chalmers's brigade from Withers' division. Behind the skirmishers were Chalmers's brigade and a makeshift brigade of 3 regiments. A mix of regiments formed the line further west, and several batteries gave artillery support. 218. At the Davis Wheat Field, a small field between Barnes Field and the Peach Orchard, the brigade commanded by Colonel William B. Hazen took more than half of the losses Nelson's division received for the whole day. 219. More fighting took place near Sour Bell Field, and after 3 hours of fighting it became stalemated. 220. Both sides withdrew around noon, putting Nelson back at Wicker Field. 221. During this fighting, Hardee was slightly wounded, although he led a counterattack. 219. West of Nelson, Crittenden and McCook advanced before being forced back to Duncan Field. 221. At noon, Buell's army had control of the Hornet's Nest. 222. Grant's attack began with Lew Wallace's fresh division driving Pond's exhausted brigade away from Jones Field. After a Confederate counterattack by Gibson and Wood, Sherman brought his division to the line and the Confederates were pushed back. McClernand and Hurlbut joined the fight, and all 4 Union divisions advanced at 10:30 am. 223. At that time, Cleburn's brigade of 800 men took significant casualties when they unsuccessfully assaulted the Union force. 224. Afternoon fighting. Edit. Positions at the end of the second day. Buell attacked again shortly after noon. In about 2 hours, Nelson and Crittenden reached the Hamburg-Purdy Road. Further west, McCook advanced westward on the Corinth-Pittsburgh Landing Road, which caused a gap with Crittenden. The gap was filled by brigades from Grant's army that had been held in reserve. The Confederate Army had held off Buell's fresh troops for a total of 6 hours, but their resistance was close to ending, 221. On Grant's side of the battlefield, Sherman and McClernand were stopped at noon when Cheatham's Confederate division attacked east of the crossroads and north of Water Oaks Pond. The two Union divisions were driven north about 300 yards, 270 m. 225. Despite light opposition at his front, Lew Wallace put his division in a defensive position, and did not resume the offensive until Sherman and McClernand had pushed back Cheatham's attackers, 226. Bragg formed another line by Water Oaks Pond, and a 2-hour fight ensued with Beauregard personally leading various Confederate units, 223. McCook's westward advance, instead of south, which began at 1:30 p.m., meant that Bragg had Lew Wallace, Sherman, and McClernand on his front, and McCook on his right flank. After Bragg fell back south of the Hamburg-Purdy Road, Beauregard counterattacked using a force that was mostly Wood's brigade. Near Water Oaks Pond, this force pushed McCook back until McCook regrouped and repelled the attackers. Soon Beauregard and Bragg were forced back, and Union troops crossed the Hamburg-Purdy Road at 2:30 p.m., 227. Beauregard withdraws. Edit. All morning, Beauregard hoped that the arrival of 20,000 men under the command of Brigadier General Earl Van Dorn would change the battle momentum back to favoring the Confederates. He was eventually notified that Van Dorn was still far away, so preparations for a withdrawal to Corinth began about 1:00 p.m., 228, note 23. At about 2 p.m., Breckinridge began forming his corps into a rearguard position near Shiloh Church. Confederate batteries around Shiloh Church began a bombardment campaign to deceive the Union soldiers into thinking the Confederate Army was still present. Around 3:30 p.m., the last of the Confederate artillery was hauled away toward Corinth, 230. Grant and Buell did not pursue the Confederate Army, and have been criticized for their decisions. One historian called this the final Federal blunder, and believed that Lew Wallace's fresh division should have been sent in pursuit, 231. It started to rain at 6:30 p.m., and the rain turned to hail as the temperature dropped, 232. The battle was over with a huge number of casualties on both sides.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and lamps. I have read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps.